So he's a very important figure from Cuban history, but we'll learn more about him next week. So are we okay to get started?
Let's go.
All right. Okay. Hello, everybody. How are you today? I hope you're having a good day. That was a nice sermon today. So we're going to kind of set up the era leading into the revolution today. We're going to switch gears to Cuba. Any people of Cuban descent here or been to Cuba? I know, have you been to Cuba before? No, it's very hard to get there, of course. And I think because of that impasse, it's kind of the forbidden fruit in a lot of ways for us. And I think we'll hear a lot more about changes in Cuba probably coming years, so it's a very, I think, topical subject. And of course, it raises different questions in Mexico, because in Mexico we have indigenous culture, in Cuba you have more African culture, and of course, what's the role of religion under socialism? And it's kind of like asking, what's the role of religion in modern life? And I think a lot of the pictures we're going to see are artists trying to either invent pictures suited to modern life, or borrow from Christian subject matter and apply it to kind of the world of Cuba leading up to the revolution, which was, as you probably know, in 1959. So we're going to be looking at the kind of 1930s, 1940s, and first ask a question about Mexican muralism in Cuba. So was there Mexican muralism in Cuba? So we're going to talk a little bit about modernism in the next few classes. I don't want to go too deep into it today, just kind of keep in mind that's kind of a cubism and abstract art, reinventing painting in light of photography, because photography is now that has a monopoly on accuracy and truth. And what would today's equivalent be of photography? Like some technology disrupting the world of art and imagery.
AI generated images.
What's that?
AI generated
Yeah,
images.
AI generated. Like photography, AI is causing us to kind of take the sacredness of the image off of that pedestal and kind of doubt every single thing we see, which is kind of unnerving, but just the reality. So we're kind of in a repeat of what happened in the late 1800s with photography, only probably to a greater order of magnitude. So artists like Picasso and others are reinventing painting in Europe, starting around 1900 into the 1930s, and now after 1940 we had a whole different kind of world. And I think we're still living in that post-World War II kind of world, which is probably very quickly about to shift to another kind of world. So it's an interesting time to reflect on us going back to this World War II era of U.S. dominance of culture and everything, but of course it's also characterized by the Cold War, and that'll be very much what we talk about when we get to Cuba. So this is all kind of lingering in the background in the world, but specifically in Cuba, but also Mexico. We were talking about this challenge of picking an art form suited to revolutionary Mexico, and we decided this is not necessarily the best kind of art form for clarity or for necessarily reaching out to the masses. In this case, I think it's exceptional. Diego Rivera chose to be more clear and I think illustrative and kind of tackle history on the wall. And remember, he was inspired by a lot of that Christian artwork. So keep in mind that there's this, when we compare Cuba and Mexico and we think about the art movement, there's a kind of call to arms attitude of Mexican muralism, which I think very much would alarm Rockefeller when he saw the painting that he ended up destroying, but also worried about the Cold War. Imagine there had been a very vibrant muralist movement in the 1960s in the United States. We could have had a lot of really interesting murals about all the changes going on, but I think we deliberately kind of shifted to something a little more neutral, which was abstract art. Maybe for those more cynical reasons, maybe also because people were just sick of all the conflict, and World War II, there was just so much death and bloodshed, people just needed something less kind of combative or less kind of hostile. We'll be continuing to answer that question, or consider that question of what about, what's the role of art in politics and of course the revolutionary society when it comes to Cuba. And yeah, so did Cuba have a Mexican muralist inspired movement? And the real answer to that question is, I think you see that in Cuba, you don't have that revolution yet inspiring the art movement. So in Mexico, you have the revolution, but in Cuba, you really don't. You have kind of an interest in an art movement, but without this revolutionary zeal. And of course, that would come in 1959. So some of these artists are kind of like what do they say at the yacht club? The boat without a crew, or a crew without a boat. So kind of a crew without a boat. And so we're going to look at these artists in Cuba who, like Diego Rivera, Siqueiros, and Orozco, are trying to come up with a uniquely Cuban style of art, and one which I think is enriched by what they hear going on across the Caribbean and Mexico. If I skip ahead, that just means I kind of don't want to get too tied down in some of the writing. But of course, the Panama Canal is a big part of U.S. shifting our focus to Central America, and we become very protective of that canal, and that of course changes, recalibrates our kind of role of the United States in the Caribbean and beyond. So we don't want any Mexican revolution destabilizing the canal, no Cuban revolution, so that's very important to remember the context of the United States and Cuba having this close relationship to the point that we kind of, I'd say that's a little too close, sending in the troops 1, 2, 3, 4 times into Cuba. And this was the case throughout the Caribbean in the early 1900s, late 1800s, with the United States kind of sending the Marines wherever we wanted. And this would change after World War II, with Kennedy having to walk that tightrope between preserving our interests and squandering our credibility abroad, because you can't just send in the Marines after World War II, or else the Soviet Union is going to say, hey, well, look, they're just as bad as they claim that we are. So just giving you a little bit of context, the United States has a very deep kind of connection with Cuba, just like with Mexico, but Cuba doesn't have all that oil. So we do treat Cuba with a little bit of neglect, and that's why a bunch of dictators like Batistas and others kind of basically run roughshod and pocket a lot of their money, and basically leave the average Cuban thinking like the government doesn't respond to them, and the United States kind of has the government in their back pocket. So there's a lot of assassinations, a lot of political intrigue leading up to the revolution, but you really don't have a revolution until 1959, well after World War II, and a lot of that is the result of tensions building because of U.S. neglect, and of course we'll talk more about this next week with Fredo Lam. But just keep in mind, you want to consider these questions like, so, Christian Renaissance art took a lot of that, or Mexican muralism borrowed a lot from Christian Renaissance art, at least in terms of using the wall as a sacred space. And I want you to remember that we were talking about art visualizing the Bible, visualizing rights and doctrine, and also reinforcing the absolute authority of the church. When it comes to an institutional critique, that's really Protestantism. Protestant art is like the critique of Catholicism, using artwork to visualize the power of the church, the Bible. That's useful for the illiterate. But remember, Protestant art kind of shifts away from artwork, or at least Protestantism shifts away from artwork, so you can have a direct relationship to God. So this is very interesting, because when we get to Cuba, you have to think about, well, what is so threatening about religion to a socialist system? And it could be one that kind of like, you have an alternative power source than just the government. And I think that's one of the maybe competition anxieties felt by socialist systems. But another thing is they don't like abstract art. As we'll see at Cuba, abstract art is almost like similar to religion. It's like a personal thing that you have that's you have a direct relationship with color and form. And likewise, that's a no-no in socialism, because there's no propaganda to that. Art needs to have sort of a propagandistic role. So keep all these in mind as we kind of shift into the modern era and look at Cuba today. So here's a painting by a very well-known artist named Avila. Now keep in mind, a lot of this artwork in Cuba with the revolution, it's a total rupture, it's a total break from the past, and that's why you might not hear a lot about a lot of these artists, because after the revolution you kind of have like a wall of unknowingness, and so we don't know as much about these artists because they weren't invited to the United States. There was no good neighbor policy. Nevertheless, you see a lot of the echoes of the Mexican muralist movement in Cuba. So any comments on this? Does this feel like a religious painting to you at all? Nothing conspicuously religious. So when I look at artwork, one thing I always look for is like, okay, are they putting a church in the background? Usually, most artists in the 1800s, early 1900s would have some reference to religion. But I do notice that it seems to be conspicuously absent. What that tells me, perhaps this artist is shifting more to that kind of collectivist, communist, kind of really focusing more on communism, which almost by definition, like why is communism so like anti-religion? What's up with that? Why is Karl Marx so like, did he just hate going to church growing up? Why did Karl Marx have such a bad, what's the basis of that? Any ideas? I think it might be like what I said, either what he said, what religion's the opiate of the masses. I mean, you could say communism's the opiate of the masses too, right? Depending on how you define opiate and masses. But definitely Karl Marx seems to be someone who was at odds with religion. But nevertheless, I think even when I look at this, for me, I see something that seems to have some of the kind of qualities of religious artwork. So this is a painting. He's adapting some of Diego Rivera's simplification. And this says they're just enjoying a leisurely Sunday. The dignity that had previously been reserved for religious figures. Okay, so maybe that's a connection to religion, perhaps. Like, what would you say is the message of this picture?
Community.
Yeah, I think community, and what tells you community here?
They're all together.
Yeah, they're all kind of together, so there's a kind of, today, I think this is not typical America today. After the pandemic, you're here at church, sure, but the rule is everyone doing their own thing and not much community. So that's definitely notable. And perhaps even like a sense of like strength through community. It feels very wholesome and kind of like no hierarchy, no one is kind of the most important. So I think you do see some.
The guy in white in the front looks pretty.
He definitely seems like the main guy, but he's not as kind of elevated over everyone. It seems like he's kind of magnet drawing everyone in, but it does seem like they all, like the rooster, they're all kind of like involved. But and you'll notice some themes. The rooster, this Guajiro is the name of a cowboy, a Guajira, female cowboy in cowgirl in Cuban history. So it reminds me a lot of like the potato eaters, like Vincent van Gogh, the people kind of getting together, the strength of community. But when you say this is like collectivism, is Van Gogh a communist? And not really, no. So you can see there's kind of like you can see that it's not so black and white, because in this case he does have religion in his painting. You see that here, a little bit of a reference to religion, and that's kind of a requirement. You got to have some kind of reference to religion because it's a way of saying that these people have a kind of, they're humble and they have a connection to a higher power. That one was too dark. I figured I'd add the lit up one, but then the art historian, he told me I had to have the original one too. So it reminds me a lot of it, kind of something like this. I could probably find a better example of a religious painting showing kind of community and collectivism. And of course, Jesus is most important here, but I think the whole idea is to show Jesus as a kind of real person, not elevated, but at eye level with everybody else. So for me, when I see this kind of community, strength, collective, but kind of there's no hierarchy. We're not looking up at something. We're kind of at eye level with everything. But of course, the halo is the main thing that's religious here, right? So are there halos in this painting? Well, you could make an argument though that of course the cowboy hat has a kind of halo. I don't think that was deliberate, but I think I think any art historian would be fine with me suggesting that you could see the halo as almost like the cowboy hat is standing for a halo. Of course, that's kind of that's a little bit more kind of stretching it, but I think it's a fair kind of thing to consider. So there's, I think, underlying a lot of pictures we're going to see today is a kind of, you can't get away from that kind of Christian subject matter, and I think the further you get away from it, the more it feels like you're losing a kind of like the heart and soul of a painting, and that's just something to consider today. So like with Diego Rivera, we saw the liberation of the peon, a lot, any religious, I think we saw this before, any kind of religious quality, this much more so. How so? What do you think? What's going on here that feels kind of religious?
Well, the body, like to Christ.
Yeah, like deposition of Jesus, kind of like coming to Jesus' aid. He's been lashed. So there's a lot of kind of suffering. What was the Mel Gibson movie, The Last Temptation? Well, not The Last Temptation, but the
Crucifixion.
The Passion of the Christ.
Passion, yes.
yeah, thank you. Yes, so that has a lot of that quality of kind of you feel empathy and want to kind of rush to his aid. And likewise here, this is the lamentation. So people running to aid Jesus. So that's definitely, I think, has a nod to that. Whether or not Diego Rivera would admit that is another matter. I feel like he might not. But let's just say he did, then what would be the kind of implication of him leaning on kind of Christian painting? Is that to say that, compassion is, it's just, these are just things to think about. Like, what is the role of religious art or does modern art still need a kind of heart and soul? Because for me, this one doesn't quite have that kind of. This is more like an indexing of an illustration of a kind of system, more so than this is like a visualization of a story. So they're very different. Now, I'm not saying that this is a story, but this is Diego Rivera kind of showing the way sugarcane is harvested, the hierarchy, the people involved. It's not as negative as you might expect, but definitely we'll see that sugarcane, when it comes to Cuba, is a very big part of oppression, with slavery, hierarchy. So we'll see a lot of sugarcane subject matter in Cuba. And during this time in Mexico, Diego Rivera is painting using wall space of institutions to paint these pictures. And the question, of course, is in Cuba, are they going to copy this? And the problem, though, of course, in Cuba is you don't have that revolution yet. So there's a lot of these artists who are trying to kind of take inspiration from Diego Rivera, but you don't quite have that Mexican revolution to kind of fund and fuel this new movement. So the movement kind of doesn't have the same kind of momentum in Cuba, and they don't have the knowledge about fresco painting. So these are some of the kind of earlier kind of subject matter you see in Cuba in the 1800s, the guajiro, the chicken, probably a slave or an escaped slave or just kind of someone on the roadside. And this is kind of very typical kind of what you would see in Cuba from that time, and they obviously are borrowing some of this imagery as they shift from kind of individual cowboy to the collective mindset in the 1930s. And then we get something like this. This reminds me more of like the sugarcane cutters. This is an artist, a Cuban artist in exile, who's commenting on the situation in Cuba. Any want to interpret what might be going on here?
Military,
Pardon me?
military.
Yeah, it's probably the U.S. military. Of course, it's after the 1898. Well, after 1898, we went to war with Spain. We used a Gatling gun, a hand-cranked Gatling gun, to defeat the Spanish in Cuba. So this is after the United States is kind of now more dominant in the Caribbean, and it's kind of an illustration of United States kind of military involved in Cuba, the bankers up there, the guns, and the people kind of looking on like kind of helpless and just kind of watching passively. Yeah, you see like a crucifix there. Yeah, I saw that too, and I wondered if there was a reference. That's really hard to have that without it being a deliberate reference. But I think what I see here is more of like the absence of anything sacred. It's just sort of materialism and capitalism, and I think that's kind of an illustration of the situation that would lead to the Cuban Revolution. So again, the sugarcane cutters. I'm going to skip over all the text there. So there is a manifesto in the 1935 to reform public education, fighting against Yankee imperialism, and for the betterment of the Cuban farmer. It's very funny they adopt that Civil War attitude, like the terminology in Cuba towards the United States, because Yankee is like a Civil War term, right? Like Yankees and the Confederates. So Cuba's almost like Cuba's waging this civil war against the United States, and for the betterment of Cuban farmer and worker. So there is this real sense of a clamor for change and disrupting the status quo in Cuba in the 1930s. And Gatorno is one example of someone trying to paint frescoes but doesn't really know how to. So he actually calls up Diego Rivera at one point to kind of learn how to paint frescoes. But in Cuba, in the unforgiving weather, frescoes don't last very long, and they just don't have the knowledge. So again, it's sort of a movement that doesn't quite have all the ingredients, like baking a cake without salt and sugar. So they're kind of missing something. So Gatorno does realize a few murals that are kind of Diego Rivera-like this one you see here. This is a literacy campaign. So teaching people, going out to the farms and teaching kids how to read. This kid doesn't look like he's paying attention. But it's really, again, another example of, it looks like Mexican muralism, but it really isn't, because Diego Rivera, that's Diego Rivera on the right. You've got this teacher going in the countryside, and those people, the armed guy on the horseback is literally protecting them from the big hacienda owners, the landowners who don't want their workers getting educated. So this is the equivalent of that in Cuba, but there's no kind of, sort of like this guy doesn't have a gun because he's not really protecting anyone, because it really isn't a literacy movement. This is all kind of like wishful thinking. Yeah, so it's pretty interesting. It's not quite the same as what's going on in Mexico, but praiseworthy effort. So yeah, there's a kind of effort, a desire to make murals, but it never really comes to fruition. We have a few examples of Gatorno. Now this would be repainted in the Bacardi room up in the Empire State Building. Here you go. And it's kind of a Mexican muralism without any of the furor, without any of that kind of clamor for social change. So it's much more of a pastoral, kind of happy view of Cuba, where everyone's happy, there's no oppression whatsoever. Here's the Bacardi, the Bacardi family got kicked out of Cuba after the revolution, and they kind of restarted their business in the capitalist world, so they repainted the Gatorno, or they have this Gatorno painting up in New York City, and I think that just goes to show how, the artist never really brought the movement from Mexico to life, and the only thing you have is up in New York City. Now there are a few exceptions to that rule. This guy, Enriquez, is really trying to kind of reinvent Cuban art with this kind of style. Some of you might have seen it before. It's a kind of a well-known painting, but it's a lot of movement. It's like this revolutionary with a gun and a cowboy hat and a horse, so it definitely feels like kind of a revolutionary, in the sense of movement and change is in the air. And he studied in Europe, just like Diego Rivera, came back to Cuba, and is kind of reinventing the Guajiro there. I don't know if I see the chicken there, but I definitely see the horse. And here's a few other examples of his work. It's definitely a unique style. You know, he wants this unique Cuban style, and I think this is the best example of a Mexican mural in Cuba. It's called The Invasion. It's a little unclear to me, but I think a really neat example of Mexican muralism in Cuba. Any comments on this? I have a few things I might have to say about this. So one, the invasion is an interesting subject because, of course, Cuba invasion is a common theme. Fidel Castro invading Cuba, the United States invading Cuba. And so it almost eerily anticipates the invasion, maybe by Fidel Castro and the Bay of Pigs, but also someone like Che Guevara and Fidel Castro have a door to enter. But it's a nice example of a mural inside of a building, and I don't think we even know where this is located because it was destroyed. So I think you're getting a sense that there's a kind of desire for Mexican muralism in Cuba, but it really never comes to fruition. And remember, lurking in the background is Picasso and Cubism, and we'll talk more about Picasso and Wilfredo Lam next week. So these modernists and the muralists are kind of both part of this wave of energy in the 1930s, and in Cuba they have varying degrees of success. This would be an example of work by Enriquez, which I think is pretty, you know, just to show he's kind of speaking for the marginal, people who are starving and poor.
That's called happy peasants.
I was gonna say.
Was
that-
Look very happy.
No, very unhappy. I think he's meant to be ironic. I think he's being kind of tongue-in-cheek. I mean, I hope so. I'm sure he understood that he was being kind of tongue-in-cheek about it. And yeah, I think it's a real, you know, unflinching view of kind of how he sees. And this is exactly the United States kind of treated Cuba with neglect. And a lot of Cubans were unemployed, impoverished, without running water, electricity. So I think this is probably a critique of the United States as much as a critique of the status quo in Cuba. And here we have a famous figure from Cuban history. Who's this? You know? Maybe you guys don't know that. Jose Marti is really kind of that Lincoln-like figure from Cuban history. And this is definitely a, you know, very much a reference to this Transfiguration by Raphael. I don't know if you can see it. Anyone disagree?
It's like the Wizard of Oz.
So yeah, like little kids pointing upward, you see that? They're definitely, you know, I see, this kid with his hands up. I definitely feel like it's some kind of like, ooh, this. And so it's a great example of how you can't really get away from religious subject matter because it's kind of the same idea that you're worshiping someone who's venerable or worthy of following. So Jose Marti was a guy who clamored for ending slavery in Cuba and died fighting for Cuban independence, and a very famous poet, and a great example of using kind of this heart and soul of religious painting to translating it for kind of updating it for the Cuban situation. So between that and this, you have a full range of kind of rural, ideal Cuba to more kind of social protest and change. And right around 1940 is when you get Siqueiros, dressed up again like a Roadrunner or Wile E. Coyote here, or maybe Speedy Gonzalez. Look at those boots. And yeah, so he goes to Cuba and hoping to kind of get a visa to the United States and paints these few painted allegory of racial equality and fraternity in Cuba, A New Day of Democracies, Two Mountains of America, Marti and Lincoln. That's this one here, as we saw that last week. But it's kind of another example of kind of a muralist in exile in Cuba. And does this lead to a Mexican muralist movement in Cuba? Not really, because you don't quite have the same circumstances in Cuba. So this is kind of like you're in between two political periods in Cuba, and the artists are trying to push kind of history ahead, kind of, you know, artificially accelerate it perhaps, or push it in one direction, but you don't have that kind of political movement or the social movement. So you do have this revolutionary figure that we see with Siqueiros, you know, the breaking the chains, like Lady Liberty breaking her chains, and that's definitely kind of one powerful, you know, thing we'll see in art in the future, especially with Cuban Revolution, you know, liberation and artwork. But the other extreme of this is what we're going to see next week, which is Wilfredo Lam. So this is modernism. This is more modernism, Cubism, inspired by Picasso, which we'll learn about next week. And this is, of course, more muralism. And the two have a kind of very different, you know, scope, scale. Muralism is more about walls. Modernism more about the easel and canvas. And it's more about kind of flattening things and treating things in a kind of more abstract way. And I think this is really, you know, he was a protege of Picasso, and we'll talk more about this next week, but this is a really wonderful example of Cuban art with sugarcane, Afro-Cuban religion, and basically reinventing sugarcane as a place of kind of religious worship rather than cutting and oppression. And so it's really interesting to think about, like, it's sort of like here it would be like, you know, slaves in cotton fields, like worshiping their religion rather than being, you know, having to cut the cotton. So kind of reinventing sugarcane as a place of liberation rather than oppression. And one example of muralism in Cuba that we see is Amelia Pelaez, who is more of kind of a modernist, but she does paint paintings that are very big, and you can still see them in Cuba, but they're not very revolutionary. I'd say they're more formal, say, color, very Matisse-like. But I think the question we'll kind of think about in the future, so, you know, is this useful for the Cuban Revolution? You know, does the Cuban Revolution look at her work, it's like, this is really what we need? And I think the answer is no, because what we'll see with the Cuban Revolution is real interest in propaganda, like film, and yes, certainly artwork too, but it has to kind of navigate through this minefield of, are you within the revolution or are you outside the revolution? That's kind of like the personal is political. And when we get to Cuba, you'll see that in the revolutionary Cuba, artists have to figure out, one, where are they within the revolution, and is there space outside the revolution for you to kind of just express yourself, or does everything have to be kind of within an ideological framework? And hopefully you feel like there's a lot of similarities between that and the United States, where, you know, if you make everything political, then there's no real room for people to not kind of to put aside their political differences. And I think that's the problem that we'll see in Cuba, that even something like this would be seen as like, this is just too kind of bougie or bourgeois because it's just sort of pretty, right, decorative. And is there room for decorative art in Cuba? So this is the Havana Libre, formerly known as the Hilton Hotel, or maybe it was the Hyatt, I don't know what it was. But this used to be owned by the United States. In fact, probably all this used to be owned by the United States. And this is her mural on the facade of the Havana Libre. You can see this today, so it's a great example of a very visible mural. But I don't think Diego Rivera would say, oh yes, this is Mexican muralism, because it's more decorative. It's more like Matisse at big scale. So it's just because a painting is big doesn't mean it's muralism, and just because it's beautiful and colorful in Cuba doesn't mean the Cuban Revolution will necessarily embrace this as the style of revolutionary art. Instead, I think what they'll go for is something more kind of based on, initially, they have to kind of navigate through the same minefield which a lot of artists in the United States have to figure out, which is, what is the artwork of the 20th century, late 20th century. And the other side of that, of course, is, I think I just lost my train of thought, but it'll come back to me in a moment if it's important. So you have this great exhibit at the moment, 1944. Remember, in 1940, we had the exhibit of Mexican art. Say in 1944, we have the exhibit of Cuban art. So we do kind of want to, I think, build some bridges with Cuba, but of course, when it comes to the post-World War II era, now we're really in a different mindset. It's not like, oh, let's all put aside our differences to fight against fascism. Now it's Cold War, Soviet Union versus the United States. So it's unfortunate, too, because the Cold War is a very ugly period in a lot of ways. And it was because, I think, of the kind of polarity. It was kind of either or, and there was no real gray area. And people like Fidel Castro really kind of benefited from this kind of either or, this kind of absolute mindset. And so here's the exhibit we see in Cuba, in the MoMA in 1944. And what's conspicuously absent here is Wilfredo Lam, who we'll talk about next week. He didn't get in this exhibit, and I think he wasn't allowed in the United States because the visa, we had closed the borders, and he was of Chinese descent, and we had a quota on Chinese immigrants. So it's a real, I think, eyesore for the United States that we didn't have Wilfredo Lam in this exhibit. And I think the exhibit they had of his work at the MoMA this last spring kind of atoned for that. So they're kind of this last spring they made up for this exhibit by having a whole show of Wilfredo Lam, which is great. And you can recognize a few of the pieces we've seen today. That's Carlos Enriquez there, the sugarcane cutters. So this is more typical, cutting sugarcane as a form of hard work, of productivity, oppression, or just sort of central to the character of Cuba. And I think you can see it's a very, Amelia Pelaez, so it's a very, I think, comprehensive view of Cuba. But again, it's not the same as the Mexican muralist movement, because it's a movement that's kind of navigating through modernism and muralism without this revolution. And of course, that revolution would come in another 10 or 20 years in 1959. But it's a revolution that's very different than the Mexican Revolution because of that kind of ideological extremism. And I think that really is going to be too bad, at least initially, for Cuba. But what will really, I think, should take interest in is that first generation of Cuban artists who come of age in Cuba after 1959, and then by 1980 they're like 20, 30 years old, and they're the ones who are going to say, this is Cuban art. Because you can't really say this is Cuban art in revolutionary Cuban art in 1960 or 1965 or 1970, because those guys are still making art from before the revolution, so they're not the true kind of examples of Cuban art. So we'll see in 1980, that's really when we get to say, these artists say, this is the new art for socialism and for waging war in the Cold War, but we have to kind of wait a few decades for that. So what we'll see next week is we'll look at Wilfredo Lam, and he's an interesting bridge because he's basically someone who was in Europe working with Picasso, and it's sort of like working with Beethoven, like really like, exceptional. And then he comes back to Cuba and becomes kind of a voice for the Afro-Cuban experience in Cuba, and a very staunch critic of the United States and the way we sort of commercialize Afro-Cuban culture in Cuba and other things like that. So I'm just kind of setting the stage for the Cuban Revolution, because one of the big things that the revolution has to answer is, well, what is revolutionary art? Where is the line between art and revolution and the personal? And so if you say, well, like within the revolution everything, outside of it nothing, well, what about your sexuality? What about your race? What about your religion? And if all of that needs to be revolutionary, when there's really no room for you to have a kind of world apart from the revolution, and that becomes a very important theme in Cuba. So yeah, this is kind of the visual what Cuba is like in the 1940s, right up in the 1950s, and what we're going to see with Wilfredo Lam is a real criticism of this kind of cha-cha-cha view of Cuba, this kind of tourism commodification of Cuba. And then moving forward, we'll kind of look at Cuban art and look at, is there any room for religion? We will see some very interesting examples of Christian subject matter in Cuban art, but we're really kind of answering the bigger question, what is the role of religion in artwork in the modern world? Of course, in the United States, we separated church and state, so artwork doesn't kind of have to be religious in this country, but it can be. But because of a separation of church and state, we've allowed this wonderful space for like making things that doesn't have to be ideological, right? It doesn't have to be revolutionary. It doesn't have to be political, although we're kind of shifting away from that. Whereas in Cuba, it really becomes the rule is everything has to be within the revolution. There's nothing outside of it, and that becomes very, I think, strangulating for culture. And that will be kind of a big theme of Cuba. So I'll keep it a little shorter today, and we'll talk about Wilfredo Lam exclusively next week.
But what about before the revolution? Because
Sure.
I do know.
We'll talk a little bit more about that next
But
week.
back in the 20s, that's where, not your grandparents, but my grandparents, I'm older, they all went to Cuba for their honeymoon.
Yeah.
So where is that?
Well, that's kind of in this era here. That's all kind of floating in the background.
You said this was in the 40, 50.
Yeah, we're kind of in the 20s, 30s, and 40s, where basically Cuba, I think, is kind of
But it was really.
paradise, a place to get away. So Wilfredo Lam, he comes back from, and we'll go in depth into kind of the period right before the revolution. He comes back after leaving Cuba, so he wants to get a visa to the United States. He's denied, so he goes to Spain instead. The Spanish Civil War breaks out. His wife and kid die of tuberculosis. He goes to France. Hitler invades France. So then he comes back to Cuba. And he's been away from Cuba for 20 years, and he's like, and Picasso's like, oh, you're the guy, because you're African descent, you are an authentic voice of the African experience. And it's basically Picasso saying, Picasso acknowledging that he's not the appropriate voice for the African world. He wants to be, but he's not. So Wilfredo Lam is kind of given this magical power from Picasso, like you are the guy to tell this story. And Wilfredo Lam goes back to his country, Cuba, really thinking, wow, this could be great. He gets to Cuba, it's all like cha-cha-cha and like kind of people kind of treating Cuba as kind of like a mafia paradise. And he's very upset because he wants Cuba to have improved as far as its self-identity and healing, and he basically goes back to Cuba and thinks Cuba's kind of worse off than ever. Afro-Cuban culture is kind of treated as kind of it's segregated. You're not allowed to practice Afro-Cuban religion in Cuba at the time because of the South's influence on Cuba and the United States. We still have segregation in the United States, and so we have segregation in Cuba too because of U.S. influence. So Cuba's kind of like just like before the independence, Cuba was sort of starving for its own sort of self kind of autonomy, and I think that's the case too before the revolution. And it's just unfortunate it became so extreme because the Mexican Revolution didn't become this communist kind of extremist thing, whereas the Cuban Revolution, unfortunately, really was a kind of part of the Cold War, and it's all about kind of reinventing society from like the ground floor, right? Whereas the Mexican Revolution was about, okay, let's kind of just work with all these different like variables and make, move forward and put aside our
Fidel
differences.
Castro is too arty.
What's that?
Fidel Castro, I just can't relate art to that person at all.
Well,
He seems
what about Fidel Castro?
I just can't, he doesn't seem arty to me, like he would care about any of this.
Yeah, well, Fidel Castro, I think, will not be forgiven. So he famously said, history will absolve me. That was his thing in prison. He got arrested and was thrown in prison by Batista and then went into exile. So there's a lot of echoes of Jose Marti and other exile. But if you become too ideological, you just, like in this country and that country, you kind of lose that important, not even just kind of, like you lose that common ground that everyone we need to have, and it's always common ground, right? So Fidel Castro just kind of staked out this extreme position. I think he was to a degree pushed that way because of Eisenhower and others kind of wanted to really make sure that we had a lot of property owners in Cuba, a lot of people own sugar and exiled Cubans who really were upset that Fidel Castro confiscated all their land. But I think all that is because we kept kicking the can down the road, and instead of kind of doing something in Cuba, intervening to lift Cuba up, we kind of neglected it. So that really, I think, came home to roost with Fidel Castro. Now that said, we still probably could have done something better to work things out with Cuba, because unfortunately it led to, Cuba in a situation we are today. And, Fidel Castro, although he did outlive like 20 presidents, 11 presidents, which is definitely commendable, that we will always have a place in the super left-wing chapters of, screw the U.S. kind of attitude in Latin, pardon my French, in Latin America. Even so, I think most people will say Fidel Castro was kind of just a dictator who never really had the kind of Nelson Mandela-like spirit of forgive your enemies and move past and heal. I think Nelson Mandela is so important for kind of that George Washington, say, I don't want to stay in power, I want to create a system of laws, not a system of man. I think that is a good model in the United States for that, just you have your time, move on, next person. And Fidel Castro was unwilling to kind of let go of his baby. And I think you got to understand, he was fighting in the jungle, the guerrilla art fight for many years. And so I do think it's sort of like a sunk cost fallacy, or someone invested so much in this thing that you're not willing to kind of let it go. So I think Fidel Castro really held on to power too long, and it's just kind of like the left-wing version of Pinochet. It was like right-wing. But you have to also understand the United States was kind of a negative force that did cultivate a lot of this animosity in the period leading up to, I think, World War I, the kind of dollar diplomacy and invading the Marines. And we invaded Haiti, we took all their gold. We've had a lot of bad experiences in the Caribbean that rightly earned a lot of umbrage from Latin America. But at this point, I think, moving forward, the United States and Latin America, should be nothing but, warmth and love. And I think Cuba will be an important part of that. And the legacy of Fidel Castro will really be a big part of that, because the military owns everything in Cuba. They own all the hotels, they own all the farms, they own all the infrastructure. So that's really going to be the key kind of voice of power in Cuba that we have to negotiate with. So. But we'll talk about Cuba and the pre-revolution. When my parents were growing up in Miami, they said, or living in Miami, they said the revolution was very exciting, Fidel Castro was very romantic for a while, but then I think it shifted to something more kind of like, kind of evil and dark and all that. So, but I think you'll find with Fredo Lam very interesting, and I think it's a question of like, what is the role, were Africans free to practice their religion in the New World in Cuba? And sadly they weren't, but with Fredo Lam as an example of an artist who is kind of trying to give Afro-Cuban religion a chance to kind of express itself in the New World. Here, I think in the United States, in a lot of ways, Afro-Cuban religion kind of blended into Christianity, and a lot of like black churches have a lot of that Afro-Cuban quality to it that is kind of alive within the Christian church, whereas in Cuba, sadly, you don't have a lot of Christian churches because the socialist system, kind of, no Afro-Cuban, no social, no religion, no nothing, except maybe when the Pope visited in the 90s, I don't know if you remember that. But otherwise, religion is not a big part of Cuba at all. So that's definitely kind of sets it apart from maybe Mexico with this estranged relationship with Catholicism and the indigenous world. But I think even in Mexico, there's much more kind of more visible presence of the church and religion. So I guess that's a good place to end. I'll see you guys next week if you want to learn about referral land. Thank you.
Thank you.